Happy Friday, everybody. James Hancock here. I'm back to shower a little love and affection on The Lighthouse from director Robert Eggers. The movie's in limited release right now, so I'll keep my opening remarks spoiler-free. That said, there's some stuff in this flick that is so deliciously perverse and deranged that I can't resist discussing them, but not to worry, I'll give you a proper warning ahead of time. The concept of this movie is relatively simple, but what makes it such a distinctive movie experience is how Robert Eggers has seized the opportunity to turn its simple premise into a glorious exercise of style and atmosphere. Eggers' decision to shoot in black and white and in the classic Academy ratio is not just a simple gimmick. When it comes to his use of light and shadow, camera movements, and shot composition, there's a case to be made for The Lighthouse as the most visually sumptuous and imaginative film any of us can expect to see all year. Fans of old school directors of photography like Stanley Cortez and Gunnar Fisher are going to be in heaven. But even better, the film features a few scenes that I think are the most glorious examples of erotic horror that I've seen in a movie all year. I'll elaborate on that in my spoiler section, but the movie stars Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson as Thomas and Winslow, two men who have signed on as lighthouse keepers for a month on a barren rock with very little to do apart from the barrage of loathsome duties like emptying bedpans and repairing roof shingles that Thomas enjoys assigning to Winslow to do day and night, all while Thomas takes care of the only interesting job, looking after the light. But as time goes by and the weather worsens and the booze starts to flow and tempers begin to flare, we are treated to a darkly comic nightmare scenario that makes a regular case of cabin fever seem like a vacation by comparison. What I loved is how the movie stirs together mystery, superstition, the supernatural, religion, mythology, and natural disasters into such a rich, concentrated brew that it becomes somewhat difficult trying to determine which scenes are actually the objective reality versus some sort of wild hallucination on the part of the characters. This is essentially a two-man show where there's nothing to do to pass the time apart from talk, tell tall tales, dirty jokes, or if they've had enough booze, dancing and fighting or some combination of the two. But over time, through drunken confessions, we start to piece together the backstories for both of these characters, leading to some haunting revelations that act as a catalyst for all the insanity that takes place in the latter part of the film. I'll definitely be needing a second viewing of this film, if only to watch it with subtitles to fully appreciate Willem Dafoe's dialogue. His accent is so thick and so specific that it borders on incomprehensible at times, but in a fantastic way where you're dying to dissect each little phrase and syllable. He's fond of reciting epic poems and making grand toasts, giving him a rugged kind of dignity and charm that I found irresistible. That is, at least when he's not farting up a storm or pissing in bedpans right next to Winslow's bed. Robert Pattinson's character Winslow can't help but appear relatively clean-cut by comparison, even when he's emptying bedpans with feces into the wind and getting it all over his face. But I continue to be impressed by Robert Pattinson's ability to hunt down and work with some of the most exciting filmmakers working today. After the Twilight films, he could have easily gone the pretty boy movie star route that's been well established by so many of his predecessors, but instead, over the last few years, he's worked twice with director David Cronenberg, but also with director James Gray, the Safdie brothers, Claire Denis, and now Robert Eggers. And on the immediate horizon, he's starring in a movie for Christopher Nolan, and also he'll be wearing the cape and cowl in a little movie called The Batman coming our way in 2021. While I might argue that in The Lighthouse, Robert Pattinson can't quite keep up with Willem Dafoe, who gives a truly inspired and deranged performance, but Pattinson still more than manages to hold his own, in particular during the movie's darkest and strangest chapters. But I should mention that some folks might struggle with the pacing of this movie. A few people passed right out beside me and proceeded to snore away, missing what in my opinion is one of the best films of the year. So I'm not expecting this movie to be a runaway commercial success for A24, but A24 gets a huge high five from me for giving the green light to such an unconventionally hysterical and disturbing movie. But that's as far as I'm going to go without sinking my teeth into the truly weird scenes on display in this film, so this is my last warning before diving into spoilers. But with that out of the way, we need to talk about the only other human performer in the movie, Valeria Karaman, who plays a mermaid that slowly begins to haunt Winslow when he's asleep and awake after he finds a small ivory statue of a mermaid buried in a hole in his bed, almost as if the previous occupant of that bed carved that hole to get his rocks off when he was feeling particularly lonely. In one of the most graphic and intense scenes of the movie, Winslow's aggressively jacking off to this poor little statue, and he's overwhelmed with these visions of making love to the mermaid, where we see in really specific anatomical detail precisely how a man would get it on with a lovely creature of that particular species. I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, in particular in Japanese animation, but this was pretty much new territory for me. But not content to rest on his laurels, Eggers manages to top this scene near the climax of the film, where Winslow and Thomas are either fighting or having sex or some combination of the two, and Winslow starts seeing visions of the mermaid warmly receiving his attention before seeing Thomas transformed into one of the most delightfully unholy creatures I've ever seen on the screen. Not only is Thomas covered in these foul, disgusting barnacles, but the lower half of his body is this nest of writhing octopus tentacles all wrapping around Winslow's body. I was absolutely slack-jawed with awe, laughing and horrified all at once, but more than anything, completely amazed at the exquisitely horrific imagination of director Robert Eggers. After seeing The Witch, I was a fan, but now I think he's one of the most creative young directors working today. The Lighthouse is jam-packed with so much remarkable imagery, like one heartbreakingly brief moment where Thomas, who's completely nude, is blasting these beams of light out of his eyes at Winslow, or another truly revolting scene where Winslow tries to bury Thomas alive. It was an incredibly claustrophobic scene, and seeing Willem Dafoe's investment in the character as dirt's being flung into his mouth and into his eyes, I mean, he can barely keep his eyes open. His mouth is caked with like rocks and dirt. It's just absolutely disgusting to watch, and Willem Dafoe is just going for it. But the main event of this film is Winslow's ongoing feud with the local seagulls, creatures that Thomas believes are imbued with the souls of dead sailors, making it bad luck to harm them. But there's one particularly assertive seagull with one eye who just won't leave Winslow alone. He's always tapping on his window or harassing him when he's going about his jobs, which results in the most explosive violence of the film as Winslow just grabs it in rage and unleashes all of his pent-up fury from the various duties that he has to do night and day. But the seagulls get the last laugh, because after Winslow gets his mind fried by the mysteries of the light atop the lighthouse, he collapses down the stairs, and the next time we see him, he's sprawled out naked on the rocks, still alive, as the seagulls are pecking out his eyes and the guts from his body. And that's the last scene of the movie. This movie's not screwing around. I couldn't believe just how grisly and macabre this movie was willing to get, especially given how hysterically funny so much of the movie manages to be, in spite of the bleak remote environment. The barren hunk of rock on which this story takes place will definitely go down as one of the most memorable locations in horror history, if this movie even qualifies as a horror film, and I'm not quite sure it does. But what's great is how this movie feels completely original. The region and the way of life are so specific, while the story is unlike anything I've ever seen before, and so much horror these days feels derivative or like a repeat of the past. But Eggers is clearly a filmmaker who's hell-bent upon carving his own path. Although, I'm about to contradict myself because Eggers also been trying for years to get a remake of Nosferatu off the ground. But in his defense, it's been nearly 100 years since F.W. Murnau made the original film, and it's been 40 years since Werner Herzog shot his remake, so I'll give Eggers a pass for wanting to remake that film. Up next, I know he's been hired to work on a Viking drama called The Northman, but whatever he chooses to do with his career moving forward, I'll always be first in line to see what his brain has cooked up. So as you can tell from the tone of my voice, I really enjoyed this movie. I'll definitely be seeing it again, and it's an absolute certainty that it'll make my top 10 of the year. But I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. So if you enjoyed this review, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel. That's very helpful. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. Thanks so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.